The call came in the middle of the afternoon, pulling me away from my desk. I worked in the high-stakes world of luxury hospitality, managing five-star hotels across Europe. It was a demanding job, but I thrived in its intensity. Adrian Miller, my boss, wasn't just my employer, he was a mentor, a confidant, and a friend. Over the years, we built a bond of mutual respect, and I trusted him like a brother. But when I stepped into his sleek corner office that day, the tension in the air was palpable. Adrian, usually composed and in control, looked deeply unsettled, his hands clasped tightly on his desk. He gestured for me to sit, his normally calm demeanor replaced by an intensity that set me on edge. "Luca," he began, his Swiss accent heavier than usual, "what I'm about to tell you, it's going to hurt. I need you to promise me something first." I frowned, leaning forward. "What's this about?" "Promise me," he pressed, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. "Promise me you won't do anything rash. I know you, Luca, your temper, your past. You were a soldier, a fighter. But this isn't a battlefield." A wave of unease settled over me, coiling in my stomach. "Just tell me," I said tightly. Adrian sighed, running a hand through his silver hair, the weight of his words dragging his shoulders down. "Luca, I consider you a brother. That's what makes this so difficult." He paused as though bracing himself. "It's about Julia?" The room seemed to shrink around me. My wife of 6 years. Julia had been my anchor when I left the military, struggling to find my footing in a world that didn't involve combat zones and constant danger. She'd been my everything. "What about her?" My voice came out low and strained. Adrian hesitated, then leaned forward, his tone soft but deliberate. "She's been having an affair. With my son Eric." The words hit me like a freight train. I stared at him, searching his face for any hint of a cruel joke. But Adrian's expression was grim, his jaw set in a mixture of anger and regret. "They're on their honeymoon right now," he continued, his voice heavy with apology. "She left you, Luca. She didn't have the courage to tell you. She ran off with Eric." For a moment I couldn't breathe. The room spun as my mind tried to process what I'd just heard. Julia, my Julia, with Eric? Adrian's son, a spoiled, self-indulgent playboy I'd always found insufferable? It felt like my chest was caving in. Adrian's voice pulled me back. "I didn't want you to find out like this. But I had to tell you before someone else did. Luca?" He leaned closer, his voice urgent. "I know you. Your combat experience, your temper. It's why I'm asking you not to do anything irreversible. But if you want revenge, I have a plan. One condition: promise me my son won't get hurt." I walked out of his office in a daze, the world around me a blur. The questions swirled in my head like a storm. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs? I replayed the last few months, searching for clues. Julia had seemed distant lately, but I'd chalked it up to stress. I remembered her mentioning a work trip to the south of France, saying she needed space. Now I knew the truth: she hadn't been working. She'd been with him, sipping champagne on sunlit beaches, celebrating their betrayal. That night, I sat alone in our apartment, the place where every corner held a memory of a life I now realized had been a lie. The urge to lash out was overwhelming. I wanted to confront them both, to demand answers, to scream until the pain dulled. But Adrian's words echoed in my mind. "Promise me you won't do anything rash." Adrian wasn't just my boss. He'd saved me when no one else would, giving me a chance to transition from the battlefield to the corporate world. If he was asking me to keep my cool, there had to be a reason. The next day I returned to his office, my anger barely contained beneath the surface. "You said you had a plan," I said, my voice low and steady. "What is it?" Adrian nodded, his expression resolute. "Revenge. But not the kind you're used to, Luca. This isn't about violence, it's about strategy." He laid it all out step by step. Eric, his only son, had always been the black sheep of the family, entitled, reckless, coasting through life on Adrian's wealth. Adrian loved him but had long since given up on him becoming a responsible adult. "This isn't just about you, Luca," Adrian explained. "It's about him too. Eric needs to face the consequences of his actions. And Julia?" He hesitated. "She made her choice. But choices have consequences. You'll get your revenge, Luca. Trust me." The plan was meticulous, requiring patience and precision. Adrian would use his resources to dismantle the illusion of paradise Julia and Eric had built. It began with a financial strike. Adrian discreetly severed Eric's access to the family accounts. Overnight, Eric's credit cards were declined, their luxurious honeymoon interrupted by humiliating confrontations with hotel staff demanding payment. Meanwhile, I played my part. Using an anonymous email account, I sent Julia messages with photos of Eric partying with other women. The images were old ones Adrian had collected over the years, but Julia didn't know that. The seeds of doubt began to sprout, and cracks appeared in their so-called fairy tale. When they returned to London, reality hit hard. Eric, accustomed to a life of indulgence, found himself cut off and unable to find work. Adrian had ensured that. Julia, disillusioned by the stark reality of their new life, began to see Eric for who he truly was. A selfish, irresponsible man who couldn't live up to the fantasy he'd promised her. But we weren't done. Revenge wasn't just about striking once, it was about making them feel the weight of their choices, one painstaking step at a time. The call came in the middle of a quiet afternoon, interrupting the rhythm of my day. I had been immersed in the demanding world of luxury hospitality, managing opulent five-star hotels across Europe, a life that left little room for disruption. But when Adrian Miller, my boss, summoned me to his office, I sensed this was no ordinary meeting. Adrian wasn't just my employer. He was my mentor, my friend, and a man I deeply respected. Over the years, he'd become more like a brother than a boss. Yet, as I stepped into his sleek, meticulously organized office, I noticed the unease in his expression, the tension in the way his hands gripped the desk. "Luca," he began, his Swiss accent sharper than usual, "what I'm about to tell you will hurt. I need you to promise me something before I say more." My stomach twisted. "What is this about?" "Promise me you won't do anything rash," he insisted, locking his piercing blue eyes onto mine. "I know you. Your past. Your temper. You were a soldier, a fighter. But this isn't a battlefield." A cold knot formed in my chest. Adrian wasn't one for dramatics, which made his hesitation all the more unsettling. "Just say it," I demanded, my voice low and steady. He exhaled heavily, running a hand through his silver hair. "It's about Julia?" I froze. My wife of 6 years. Julia had been my anchor when I left the military, struggling to adjust to a world that no longer made sense. She had been my partner, my confidant, the woman I thought I'd build a life with. "What about her?" I asked, my voice trembling. Adrian's expression darkened. "She's been having an affair." He paused, his words slicing through the silence. "With my son Eric?" It felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the words. "Julia and Eric?" Adrian's son, the spoiled, self-indulgent playboy who had coasted through life on his father's wealth? "They're on their honeymoon now," Adrian continued, his voice heavy with regret. "She didn't have the courage to tell you. She ran off with him." The betrayal hit me like a freight train, leaving me numb and disoriented. The woman I had loved and trusted had torn my world apart, and with him. Adrian leaned forward, his voice dropping to a solemn whisper. "I had to tell you myself. But Luca, listen to me. I know how this will feel. I know what you're capable of. But I'm begging you, not for me but for yourself, don't do anything rash. If you want revenge, I'll help you. But promise me my son won't get hurt." I left his office in a haze, the world around me fading into the background. Questions raced through my mind. How long had this been going on? What signs had I missed? Julia had been distant in recent months, but I had chalked it up to stress. She had mentioned needing space, even planning a work trip to the south of France. Now I knew the truth. She hadn't been working, she had been with him, celebrating their betrayal. That night, I sat alone in our apartment, surrounded by memories of a life that now felt like a cruel illusion. The urge to lash out was almost unbearable. I wanted to confront them, to demand answers, to make them feel the pain they had inflicted on me. But Adrian's words echoed in my mind. He had given me a chance when no one else would, guiding me from the chaos of the battlefield to the polished world of luxury hospitality. If he was asking me to stay calm, there had to be a reason. The next day I returned to his office, my anger barely contained. "You said you had a plan," I said through gritted teeth. "What is it?" Adrian's expression was resolute. "This isn't about violence, Luca. This is about strategy." He laid out a meticulous plan step by step. Eric, he explained, had always been the black sheep of the family, a man who relied on wealth and privilege to shield himself from the consequences of his actions. Adrian loved him but had long since grown tired of his entitlement. "This isn't just about you," Adrian said. "It's about making Eric face the weight of his choices, and Julia as well. They built their lives on lies, Luca. Let's make them confront the truth." It began with their finances. Adrian cut Eric off from the family fortune, severing his access to the limitless funds he had always taken for granted. Overnight, his credit cards were declined, his lavish honeymoon interrupted by awkward confrontations with hotel staff demanding payment. Meanwhile, I played my role. Using an anonymous email account, I sent Julia carefully curated messages. Photos of Eric with other women, images Adrian had collected over the years, landed in her inbox. She didn't know they were old, and I watched as doubt and paranoia began to eat away at their relationship. When they returned to London, reality hit hard. Eric, now financially destitute and ostracized by his father's influential network, found himself floundering. Julia, who had traded everything for a life of luxury, quickly realized the man she had chosen couldn't deliver on his promises. The cracks in their relationship deepened, widening into unbridgeable chasms. The turning point came at a gala Adrian hosted at one of the most prestigious venues in London. Eric, desperate to reclaim his footing, saw the event as an opportunity to rebuild his reputation. Julia, equally determined to salvage her image, arrived dressed in a gown she had bought on credit, her confidence a fragile facade. I attended at Adrian's invitation, blending seamlessly into the crowd. I wasn't there to gloat. This wasn't about petty satisfaction. I simply wanted to witness the unraveling of the lies that had destroyed my life. As the evening progressed, Eric's composure began to crack. Guests whispered about his fall from grace, the scandal surrounding his name too juicy to ignore. When an influential journalist cornered him with pointed questions about his financial missteps, Eric lashed out. Julia, attempting to defuse the situation, only fueled his frustration. "I don't need your help, Julia," he snapped, loud enough for the room to hear. "You're part of the reason I'm in this mess." Her face flushed, but Eric wasn't finished. "You think you're some kind of trophy wife? Living off me, pretending to be something you're not? Guess what? The game's over." Adrian, ever the tactful host, stepped in and led Eric away, his expression a mix of disappointment and resolve. I followed at a distance, watching as Adrian confronted his son. "You've embarrassed yourself enough tonight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's time to grow up, Eric. You've spent your life blaming others, but this is where it ends." Their conversation ended with Eric storming out, leaving behind a room filled with whispers and stifled laughter. Julia followed shortly after, her head held high but her facade crumbling with every step. In the weeks that followed, their lives unraveled completely. Eric moved into a small, dingy flat, a far cry from the luxury he once enjoyed. Julia, shunned by her former social circle, was forced to rebuild her life from the ground up. One day Julia reached out to me, her voice trembling with regret. She wanted to talk, to explain. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe and I listened as she poured out her apologies. "I made a mistake," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I wanted more. I thought Eric could give me the life I deserved. But I was wrong. I didn't feel anger anymore, only a strange sense of closure. Julia," I said finally, "I don't hate you. But I've moved on. You should too."